Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to set up Docker on Windows. Now this is a fairly straightforward process, but it's in lieu of Docker Desktop. Now if you're using Docker Desktop, there's nothing wrong with Docker Desktop. It's a great piece of software. It'll get you a great out-of-box experience that will have you up and running with Docker and Kubernetes with the simple install of a piece of software. However, there might be a reason that you don't want to use Docker Desktop. And one of those reasons might be something like a more custom setup that you need on your particular environment. Another one might be licensing. If you're working for an organization that has more than 250 people or more than $10 million in revenue, they require that you get a license for Docker Desktop. Whatever the reason might be, you can easily install Docker using some of the common tools that are available on Windows. So I'm going to show you how to use these common tools to get a Docker environment that'll work just like you had Docker Desktop installed, except you won't have the Docker Desktop GUI, obviously. But in all cases, for all intents and purposes, you'll be able to use it with your dev tools. You can use it on the command line or whatever you might want to do with Docker in whatever context that you might be working. So to make all this work, we're obviously going to need Windows 10 or 11, so a fairly modern version of Windows. Now, because we're talking about mostly Linux specific technologies, we're going to need a Linux context. So we're going to use WSL2, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux, on Windows. And that's a fairly straightforward setup process that doesn't require any kind of virtual machine software like VMware or VirtualBox. You can install it natively from within Windows and then use the Microsoft Store to get a specific distro. Now with WSL2 installed, we can then install the two different environments. So we're going to need a Docker environment and then a Kubernetes environment. So the Docker environment, of course, is going to have the Docker engine running. So we'll install the Docker engine in WSL2, and then we'll use Chocolatey to install the command line, which is the client software. And then that will be set up. And then we'll configure the two to talk together. And then for Kubernetes, we're going to install Kubernetes on WSL2. We're going to be using micro-k8s for this, which is a fairly easy to install Kubernetes setup. And you can just basically run one command and it just works. And then we'll install the Kubectl, which is the client for Kubernetes, using Chocolatey as well. Then we'll configure those two to work together. And once you have all these components, you're up and running with a full-fledged Docker environment that will let you do Docker development as well as Kubernetes development. So installing WSL2 is pretty easy. So open up your start menu and type in features, and you'll see this option for turn on Windows features. And that'll pop up this little dialog here. So let me zoom in on that. And you'll scroll down on this, you'll see Windows Subsystem for Linux right here. So check that right there, and that will give you Windows Subsystem for Linux. And then you'll want to turn on virtual machine platform. So WSL is essentially a really lightweight VM that has tight integration with Windows. So it's not a full virtual machine experience. So you're not going to see a hypervisor, and you're not going to feel like you're actually running a separate machine because of the tight integrations that it does have. So it makes it feel much more native than a typical virtual machine. So check those two. And if you also want to enable containers for Windows containers, you can check this option right here as well. And once you have those checked, then you click OK. It will install the feature, and you may have to reboot your machine. Once those are done, there's one other step that we have to do. So the next thing we need to do is install the distro on top of WSL2, and that's pretty straightforward. So open up the start menu then and type in Microsoft Store, and you'll get the option for Store right here. And go ahead and launch the Microsoft Store. Now this will take a second to launch, but it's just going to download some content that you can see right here. Now once you have that, you can then come up here to your search right here and type in Ubuntu, and that will give you some options here. So we're going to go with Ubuntu 22.04. That's the LTS version, and that's going to search for it. And this is going to give you a lot of options here you can use for 22.04, 20.04, and then this one right here. But we're going to go with this. If you have it installed already, you'll see what I'm seeing here, but otherwise you'll see an option for install. Just click on install, and then that will download and install WSL2's version of Ubuntu onto your machine. And so that will install. You might have to restart WSL2 if you've already done so, but once that's installed, your Linux context is ready to go. And then we just need to open up WSL2 and install the Docker context as well as the Kubernetes context. So to start WSL2, it's pretty straightforward. Open up a terminal and just type in WSL, and that will start up WSL2. And the Ubuntu will boot. It might take a while the first time you have loaded it, because it's actually loading the virtual machine in the background. But once that loads, then you'll get a prompt that looks like you're logged into a Linux machine. And so this will allow you to use this just like you were using a command shell inside of a Linux context. So I can run all the same commands. I can then do everything like I can on a Linux context. If I go cd tilde, that'll take me to the root folder, and you can see that I have a couple of things right here that are already installed. So let's go ahead and install Docker inside of WSL2, which is actually pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and walk through these instructions. So to finish WSL installation, we need to enable systemd. Now systemd is just a service that manages other services. It allows us to start and stop services. It controls the starting of services at boot, and it will also handle things like crashing and logging and attempts to restart things and all of the things that a service manager will typically handle. But it's not enabled by default on WSL, so we're just going to enable it by simply adding a file to WSL. And you do that by simply running nano, which is just an editor. So we're going to run sudo nano /etc/wsl.conf and then type in a password for our WSL environment. And then you add this text to the file. If the file doesn't exist, it'll create it. And you just need to add this text right here, which I'll put in the video description down below. Now, once the file is edited, you hit Control-O to save and Control-X. Now drop out of WSL and then type in WSL --shutdown, and that will shut it down. And then we type in WSL to restart. And then that will restart WSL with that new configuration with systemd enabled. So to install Docker on WSL2, it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to run a couple of commands inside of the prompt here. So to do that, we're just going to run first a curl command to get a instance of get-docker.sh, which is just a script that will download it and configure Docker in this context. And I'll put these in the video description down below so you can run these commands. So this will download get-docker, and then we're going to do a chmod +x get-docker like this. And what that will do is make this script executable, and then we can run the script as such. So we run it with sudo, and then we do -get-docker. And that will then prompt us for the password. And this will then allow you to execute this in the root context of WSL2. So it will sleep for a while, give you a chance to abort. And if you've already installed it, then it will install it. But if not, just let this thing run through to completion. It's just basically going to add some repositories to your apt packages, and then it's going to use apt install to install Docker on your machine. So once you have this up and running, you should be able to type in Docker commands like Docker ps-a. And this one is not running because I need to put sudo in front of it. And that's because the Docker socket right here is actually protected. And we're going to expose that though whenever we actually configure this to use the Docker client to talk to WSL2. Now that we have Docker installed, we're going to configure Docker with the systemd startup. And that systemd startup will just start Docker whenever we start WSL, but we want to edit the start command so that it will be exposed to the Windows host for WSL. So we're going to do that by editing the service for WSL, which is just this command right here. So sudo nano /lib/systemd/system/docker.service. Now, in this file, you'll see a line that has exec start. It's got the path to Dockerd, which is the Docker engine. And then it's got -h. And -h is just a flag for telling Docker where you want to expose this to. And it's saying -host, really. And by default, it's using just a Unix socket. But we're going to add a TCP socket to the end of this. So we're going to use -h, and then we're going to do TCP://0.0.0:2375, which is the port number that this is going to be listening on. So once we have that, we hit Control-O and then hit Control-X to leave nano. And now we're going to reload the settings. So we're going to do sudo and do systemctl or systemctl. And then we're going to do daemon-reload. And that's going to reload the settings. And then we're going to run sudo systemctl, and then we're going to restart Docker using this same thing. So restart Docker. And that will then restart Docker with that new host configured. And it's now going to be running on 2375. So to install the Docker CLI, we first need to get Chocolatey on our machine. You probably already have it, but in case you don't, there's a simple command you can run. I'll put it in the video description down below. And it's basically just going to set some parameters in PowerShell and then run a script from the Chocolatey community that will install it. So you'll need to be in a terminal under administrative mode for PowerShell for this to work. So you can do that just by going to terminal and then right-clicking on that and then run as administrator. But otherwise, just run the script. I've already run it, so I don't need to reinstall this. But once you've installed it, exit out of PowerShell and come back in, and then you can type in Choco, and you should see some output that looks like this. It'll tell you what version you're using and so on. So we're going to use this to install the Docker CLI and the Kubectl's command line. Installing Docker CLI is super simple, so we're just going to run Choco install Docker, and that will install the Docker CLI. And so if you already have installed, you can click yes, but I've already installed this, so I don't need to install it. So everything is up and running by virtue of that. So if I just type in Docker right here, I'm probably not going to get any, I'm just going to be able to see the list of commands and so on. I can't use it with the Docker engine yet because I need to configure it to work with that Docker engine, which is actually really straightforward as well. Now, after installing the Docker CLI, we need to configure it to talk to the Docker engine that we installed already. Now, there's two ways to do this. You can do it temporarily just using the command line, or you can do it permanently, and I'll show you how to do both. So the first thing that we need to do, though, regardless, is get the IP address. Now, this is pretty straightforward. So to do this, just run a command, which again, I'll put in the video description down below. This is basically going to tell WSL to run this command inside of WSL's Linux context. So it's saying, give me the IP address and show it for the Ethernet adapter 0. So if I run this command, it will give me some output that looks like this. And so we're basically just looking for the IP address, which in this case is 172.19.155.226. So you can copy that, or you can just memorize it, whatever you might want to do. And then you want to do a set for an environment variable. Since I'm using PowerShell, I'm going to use env : and then I'm going to type in docker _ host, and then I'm going to do equals, and then we want to use single quotes, and then type in TCP : / and then paste in that IP address, and then put in the port 2375 that we configured when we set up the Docker engine. And with that, we should be able to run some Docker commands against it. So Docker ps-a, not going to return anything, but in any case, you can see that it's reaching out to that Docker host and getting information from it, and it can interact with it. So you can build Docker images or pull Docker images, whatever it is you're going to be doing with Docker. So this means that our Docker environment is set up. So this is temporarily setting the Docker host. So if we want to do this permanently, we need to set it as an environment variable for either a user context or for every user in Windows. So that's pretty easy to do as well. So to set up environment variables, type in, open your start menu and type in environment up here in the search. And you'll see an option under best match as edit environment variables right here on the control panel. And then you'll see this button right here. So the button is basically there to launch the dialog for setting environment variables. So you can launch that. And you'll see a dialog that will let you set them for either the user scope or for the system scope. Now, I've already set one on mine for the system scope, but basically what we're going to do is set a variable that looks like this. So you're set docker _ host, and then you put in TCP : / the IP address for WSL2, then the port number 2375. Is the exact same data that we put in on the command prompt right here. So once you have that, click OK, and you're done with that. And you can click OK here. And your environment variable is then set. Now, you'll have to exit your terminal session and restart it, but you can do that by launching a new PowerShell session, and then you should be able to run Docker commands, and everything should work fine. If you want to check it just to make sure, type in, you can type in dir env : and that will show you all of your environment variables, and you should see one for Docker host in there right there. So again, very easy to do. If you've never done it, this will make it permanent, and so that you can edit that as you see fit. And there's other ways to do it with Docker context and what have you, but this is just for WSL2 for doing dev work in this local environment. In most cases, apps, if you're going to be working in an IDE or something like that, it's going to look for Docker host and the environment variable, because that's where it's going to look for the Docker context. So if you're using like Eclipse or Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio that have Docker integration, it's going to have this expectation that that's been set. So once that's set, everything should just work, and you shouldn't have to do anything special to make all of those tools work with WSL2 for your Docker environment at this point. So now that we've set up Docker, the next thing to do is set up Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is pretty much the same kind of process. We're going to use the command line to set up micro-k8s, and then we're going to use Chocolatey to install our command line utility, and then we'll configure the command line utility to talk to our Kubernetes context. So to set up Kubernetes, we're going to use Snapcraft, which is, I wouldn't say it's a package manager, but it's kind of like a package manager for installing what is called a snap. Now, a snap is basically a program or a set of programs that is kind of bundled together that gets installed into its own isolated environment inside of Ubuntu or whatever Linux distro that you might be using that supports Snapcraft. Now, it's pretty straightforward to use it. So we're going to be using it in the Linux WSL2 instance that we have installed. So first we need to install it though, and installing it is easy to do. So just run sudo apt-get install, and you can just type in snap, and that will ask you for a password and it'll install it. I've already installed it, so it's installed on my box. And once you have snap installed, then we can use snap to install micro-k8s. So once you've installed Snapcraft, it's easy to install the micro-k8 snap. So just run a single command, snap install micro-k8s classic. The classic parameter just tells it to use this in a classic way instead of using the isolated environment, but otherwise it's going to feel like a snap application. So I'm going to run that. I've already installed it, so I don't have to reinstall it. And by doing that, it's basically going to start micro-k8s as well. And you can check on it by running micro-k8 status wait ready. And this will allow us to, you probably want to run this as sudo, and then it will tell you if it's running, if things are working, and so on. And you'll see that everything is currently working in this context. Now, there's some things that you can turn on and turn off. Now, what we'll probably want to enable is ingress. So if you don't have that installed, so you can do micro-k8s enable ingress, and that will enable ingress controller on this guy, which basically enables the ability to have HTTP ingress, which is pretty important for doing different kinds of things with our Kubernetes context. The rest of this that it installs by default, DNS and Helm, are fairly well used. So those are just installed by default. There's a lot of other things that you can enable. You can enable the dashboard if you want to use a GUI. And there's some other things that you can enable, like Prometheus if you want to get that logging, and then storage if you want to use that, but that's been deprecated. And there's a lot of other things that you can enable. But all this to say is, once you have it up and running, it's pretty straightforward. It's a full-fledged Kubernetes environment, but it's running on a single node. So pretty much everything you can do in a Kubernetes context, you can do with micro-k8s. So there's no real limitations. It's just you're running this in a single node setup. So if you're going to be testing for multiple nodes and failovers and all that, you'd need, of course, a multi-node setup. And you can do that with micro-k8s as well. But for our purposes, we're just basically going to use this one as it sits for our purposes of doing Kubernetes development. But with all that, now we need to get the configuration for this. And the configuration is basically the file that tells us what we need to connect to this. And so that's going to be using Kubectl. And Kubectl will allow us to export that, and then we can use that file and import it into our Kubectl command line utility that we're going to install with Choco. So to get the configuration, we need to run a utility to export it. So micro-k8s has that built right in, so we can run a single file that will show us the configuration. So you can just run sudo, and we can do micro-k8s config, and with sudo, and that will output a YAML file that has all of the data that we need to connect to this, and like the host name, for instance, right there. And then this is the certificate it uses for authentication. and other parameters. And then there's the token for the admin. So all of this is in that YAML file, but we need to put this out to a file, or you can copy the text as well from the screen. But we're going to just copy it from the screen because that's how we're going to import this into our local context in Windows. So to do that, I'm just going to highlight it all and then right click, and that's going to copy it into the clipboard. Now I'm going to launch a text editor right here, and I'm going to open up a brand new file and paste in my text right there. And so you can see that it's just a pure text file. So to save this, we need to put this in a specific folder. So let me zoom in on this real quick right here. And let's get this up a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. And we're going to go into our C drive and then go down to users and then find your user. And then there's a hidden folder that you might not see. I've got mine visible, but it's \, if you just want to type it in, .kube right here. And this is the folder that contains your config files. So if you do star on this folder, you should be able to see all of the files that are in this. And I've got a few right here already where I've already imported this. But in any case, what you can do with this is save it off as a file name. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's just a file name. Doesn't matter. I can call it microcates1 or something like that and just save it. And that is going to save that text file. And then we can use that to configure our Kubernetes locally. And that is after we install it using Choco. So installing Kubernetes CLI or Kubectl is really easy to do. Once you have Chocolatey installed, which we already did, you just run choco install Kubernetes CLI. Now you'll need to run this as an administrator, PowerShell administrator, or you can run it as a command prompt using administrator mode. But either way, you run that and install it. I've already installed this, so I don't need to reinstall it. But in any case, it's pretty straightforward. And once you've installed it, you probably have to close out PowerShell and reopen it so that you get the path mapping. But you should be able to type in Kubectl. And with that, you can then type in version or whatever commands you want to get. It'll give you version information, or you can just type in help, and that'll give you, help information, whatever. It'll give you lots of different options for running this. Now, our concern is going to be inside of that kube folder where we saved that file that we got from microcate. So if you cd to your user, and mine is Blaze, so C: users Blaze, and then you do .kube, you should see a list of files. Now, I saved mine as microcates1, and if you already had a connection to an existing context for Kubernetes, you're going to see this config file right here, and that is the default file. So if you don't have one of these, you can just simply rename this file as config and you're done. If not, what we want to do is we want to merge these. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So to merge those two files together, the first thing we need to do is set an environment variable. So in PowerShell, we're going to do that with this. We're going to set a temporary variable right here called kubeconfig. And this will basically tell Kubernetes which files to look at whenever it wants to configure. So if you wanted to set an environment variable like we did already for kubeconfig and just have two separate files, you can definitely do that. But what you have to do is you have to do a semicolon separated list of files. So the default one, of course, is this one right here. And then we're going to add to that file that we just created. So in this case, C:user blaze.kube microcates1, and that will then set the environment variable for kubeconfig. Now, with that, what we can then do is then use Kubectl to flatten that. So we're going to do Kubectl config view -- flatten and then type in new config. And new config is the output file name for our merged configuration. And so if we do ls on this, we should see a new file that says new config right there. So if I do cat new config, it will show you all of the different contexts that I have inside of my configuration right here. So that is the merged version. So once that's done, I'm going to undo the config variable right here just to use config again like this. And then I'm going to basically rename config to config.old like this. And then I'm going to rename my new config to config like that and replace it. And so now I have merged those two files together, and I should have three files now: config.old, and then of course microkates1. So now that that's done, I can now use Kubernetes command line utility, or Kubectl, to connect to microkates. So to list the context, we're going to run Kubectl, then we're going to type in config, and then type in get-context. And that will list all the contexts that are configured in that config file. And then if I could spell context correctly, it would give me the output. And you can see that I have several of them listed already. So I have several that are online for whatever reason. I've got a lot of different ones for that. And then I have this one right here that I just imported. And then this is one I was playing with, and then of course Rancher Desktop if you're going to use Rancher Desktop. But in any case, if you want to switch context, that too is pretty easy. All you need to do is type in, instead of get context, you can say use context like this, and then type in the name right here. So in our case, microkates. And now I've switched context to microkates, and I can then do Kubectl commands against my microkates configuration. So Kubectl get pods, for instance, and that I don't have anything running currently, but this is now configured to use our microkates configuration. So now with all this, let's test this all and see if it all works. So let's run a Docker command against it to test our Docker install, and then let's run one for Kubernetes, and we'll use that to test our Kubernetes install. So to test Docker, I'm just going to run my DOS game demo that I've used in other videos. So I'm going to type in Docker run, and then I'm going to do -p for a port forward. Let's do port 8080 to port 80. And then I'm going to tell it my command, my container image that I want to run. So it's going to be blaze/dos-game. And that should run Commander Keen. It's going to pull this and start running it. As soon as this pull is done, we'll be ready to go. Okay, it looks like everything is up and running. So I should be able to use the DOS command to connect to this guy. So that is going to be on port 8080 on the IP address for my instance of WSL. So let's go ahead and connect to this using a browser. So I'm going to type in http:// and then I'll put in the IP address for WSL and then port 8080. And that's going to pull up a list of files here. I'm going to click on VNC, connect to this guy, type in password 1, and then that's going to give me my DOS box instance running inside of a container right here. So I should be able to type install, and that's going to install Commander Keen. And once this is installed, I can make the game playable, and I can run this, and this will allow me to play Commander Keen inside of a container running on WSL2 using the what we just installed on top of that. So again, fairly easy to do, nothing really to it. So here we go, and we're just running this and playing Commander Keen. So that's that. Let's go ahead and use the same thing to run another instance of this game, but this time in Kubernetes. So to test Kubernetes, I'm just going to run a simple Kubernetes manifest file. So if I run cat on keen.yaml, you can see that it's just deploying a deployment, a single node, a single pod deployment right here, exposed on port 80, and then it's using a service on a node port to expose it. So I'm going to be reaching out to port 31,000 on the IP address of the WSL2 instance that we got earlier. So to deploy this, I'm going to run kubectl apply-f keen.yaml, and everything is created. And I can do get pods to show you the pods that are running. I can do get services for services, and of course deployments for deployments. And it looks like everything is already up and running. So if I launch a new window and I go to http://172, there it is. I'm on port 31,000 on the IP address of WSL2. So I'm going to click on this, and this is going to pull up no VNC. And I'm going to type in the password for this. It's password 1, really secure, I tell you. And I'm going to zoom out just a bit here so we can get the whole thing on the screen. And I'm going to install this, and that's going to install Commander Keen. And then we can launch it, of course, and play our game in a browser, this time running on Kubernetes. So all of this is pretty straightforward. I know there's a lot of command line utilities that you have to run and so on, but it's actually a fairly straightforward process. It's not as easy as, of course, installing something like Docker Desktop, but all things considered, it's probably, in my opinion, the most straightforward way to get a Docker environment up and running with little or no fuss, using a lot of the tools that are very familiar, like Chocolatey, and I'm using WSL2 and using different things available on the Ubuntu command line, like apt-get or snap. And so all of these things work together to give you a full-fledged Docker environment that you can use for Docker development, so building images and so on, and for doing Kubernetes development as well. So building Kubernetes manifests, building Helm charts, doing all that kind of stuff, and testing and deploying those things as well. So again, it's something that I've used in the past, and this is actually my preferred way to do this. But if you want to use Docker Desktop, certainly use the tool. You can use Rancher Desktop as an alternative, but I prefer this kind of more manual approach because it gives you a lot more finesse, and of course, it gets you a little bit closer to the environment so that you get a little bit more familiar with how all these tools kind of work together. So again, something to check out. If you like this content, please subscribe to the channel and like this video, share it with your friends, and let me know what you think in the comment sections down below. If you have other tips and tricks for installing this kind of stuff, I'll be glad to follow up with you on any questions you may have, or if you have a more efficient way, certainly tell me all about it. I'd love to hear about it. So thanks for watching, and as always, looking forward to seeing you on future videos.
If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up, or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @TheOneMule. And as always, thanks for watching.